Okay, we set. Let me just slightly there. All right. All right, well, thanks for showing up. Quite a surprise. No, I'd like to start off actually by thanking George Lopez and the one, the only, and yes, he's here, folks, Duke, the puppet, Kimball, for asking me to share this presentation today. And also for Leslie Tiemann, so working so diligently to set it up. And thank you all for turning out. I've been looking forward to this. In fact, the whole reason I got into rock art studies is because it's something we lost through colonization. And that's why I went after it. And I went after it with our own epistemologies, our own knowledge systems. And so this is the first time I think I've been able to talk to my own people about rock art for a change. It's only been 20 years. Okay, so I'd like to, so today's talk about petroglyph point is going to take me just about an hour, actually an hour and 5 minutes. I've timed it consistently to that. So I'm going to start off by providing some general information about the monument's physical characteristics. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the earliest inquiries made about the petroglyphs and how answers to these inquiries influenced the research that followed. And in fact, it derailed it. Well, I'll point that out. Then now after that, I'm going to spend a great deal of time talking about Klamath and Modoc mythology. And my reason for this is because my main argument here is that myth, when understood through the framework of shamanism, is the appropriate literature for understanding the petroglyph point petroglyphs. And then finally, we'll examine some of the petroglyphs within this shamanic mythological framework, and then leave the floor open for questions. Okay, you have that in your, hang on 1 second, we have, yes, I sure can. Oh, let's go like that. Just tell me if that's better. Awesome. Oh, let's try this again. There we go. So, okay, good. So Petroglyph Point, as you know, is situated in the northeastern boundary of Lava Beds National Monument near Tule Lake, California, within the traditional homeland of the Modoc. And the red square at the upper right-hand corner of the slide there shows the site's location within the monument. Now today, as you can see, the petroglyphs are protected by this here chain link fence. Now this was erected in the 1930s by the Civilian Conservation Corps in an effort to put a stop to the tourists who'd literally been chunking off sections of the petroglyphs and then carting them home as souvenirs. Now, unfortunately, the fence doesn't protect all of the petroglyphs, and vandalism has continued to occur even as late as 2013. And this latest occurrence, in fact, is what inspired me to start focusing my research on this monument so that we can learn as much about it as we can while we can. And for those of you who are aware of this, it also inspired my idea for the documentary, which I swear, Clay, I'm almost done writing. So this mountain, sometimes referred to as Prisoner's Rock, is considered to be the very heart of Modoc territory, not only in terms of its location, but also because of its spiritual importance. The Klamath and Modoc both regarded this mountain as the creation point, where the spirit Kamoosh first created dry land by scooping up mud from the bottom of Tule Lake. And then afterwards, he's said to have made the rest of the Earth's landmass from this point outward, somewhat in the nature of weaving a basket. Now, according to our ancestral beliefs, any place on the landscape where spirits acted or lived are thought to be charged with their supernatural powers. And so this mountain's creation by a spirit already makes this mountain a sacred place. And by extension, this makes this mountain a place where certain people will travel to in their search for supernatural power. And I say certain people because the markings on this monument suggest that the site was reserved for shamans or kukes, who were the ritual practitioners of the tribe and the only people in our culture who actually made and used rock art. Such markings, in fact, were thought to be dangerous, or even deadly to those who were not initiated, by which I mean non-shamans. Well, this kind of information, which the earliest researchers weren't really interested in at the time, actually provides us very significant clues about the nature of the petroglyphs carved all over this mountain. And this, in fact, is what we're going to be exploring throughout this presentation. this mountain's sacred connotations and what they have to do with the petroglyphs. I'm sorry, but the union says I get a coffee break here. So briefly, here's some examples of the imagery. And as you can see, some of the glyphs were made with an engraving instrument, maybe like a beveled deer femur or something of that nature, while others were made by incising the rock face with a sharper instrument, like the edge of a projectile point, a sharp stick, something of that nature. Curiously enough, other images were made by drilling holes into the rock face, sometimes in a way that created patterns, but not always. And I suppose I should mention at this point that the mountain itself was made up of welded volcanic tuff, which has the consistency of sandstone. And this, of course, is what made carving and drilling petroglyphs into the rock face so easy. Oops. Now, according to the latest estimate, the monument contains more than 5,000 images that range from somewhat naturalistic figures to others that have been called geometric abstract. By naturalistic figures, I mean figures that are somewhat recognizable, like the human-like and the insect-like form shown on the far left. Geometric abstract figures consist of things like groups of wavy lines, zigzags, grids, triangles, bisected lines, much like the composition you see over on the right. Now, looking at these images, especially the so-called geometric abstract figures, it's just not hard to see why they've intrigued researchers and teased the public's imagination for well over a century now. I mean, over the years, they've been called things like maps, astronomical charts, solstice markers, doodling, ancient Scandinavian fish tallies, the writing system of vanished civilizations, and so on and so forth. Anything but a site created by the Modoc or their ancestors. See, in the earliest days of research, especially right after the Modoc War, when tensions were still riding pretty high, it was just hard for Westerners to accept that this petroglyph concentration had anything at all to do with the ancestral Klamath or Modoc. And this, as you might imagine, significantly influenced both the type and especially the quality of research that followed. Anyway, keep this geometric abstract composition in mind as we're going to return to it at the end of our discussion today. And my purpose will be to use this image to demonstrate that the petroglyphs on this monument are knowable. In spite of over a century of claims made to the contrary, these petroglyphs are knowable. And what's more, they're knowable in a Klamath and in a Modoc way. That's my claim. Now, the earliest inquiry about the petroglyphs that I'm aware of came at the conclusion of the Modoc War in 1873. Two military officers had asked an old Indian man what the petroglyphs were all about. And he replied that his papas, repeating the word papa, apparently in an effort to express the site's great antiquity. Just a few years later, in 1881, Dr. James Dennison, who was a physician at the Klamath Indian Agency, received a nearly identical reply from the Klamath Indians about one of their pictograph sites near Klamath Lake. The general consensus among the Indians, he wrote, is that Kamokamsh had created rock art when he first created the world. And Kamokamsh, as you know, is the Klamath name for the creator spirit Kamoosh. And I'll be using both names interchangeably throughout the presentation, depending on what source I'm citing at the moment, just to stay true to my sources. Anyway, like the Klamath, or like the Modoc, the Klamath emphasized the rock art's spiritual origins and its great antiquity. Now, as you can see from this quote from Leslie Spear's ethnography on the Klamath some 50 years later, the Klamath once again denied making the pictographs at all, attributing their creation once again to the spirit Kamokamsh. And I think the answer was something like Kamokamsh made him at when he first made this country, by which I think he meant at the beginning of time. Now, even though these statements didn't make a whole lot of sense to the earliest researchers who inquired about Petroglyph Point, they actually provide us with very significant clues pertaining to its actual origin and purpose. But in order to understand this, we need to first understand the ritual philosophy that inspired both the petroglyphs and these early, somewhat cryptic statements made by the ancestral Klamath and Modoc. And that's because both stem from the same worldview. That is, both stem from our myths. So let's look again at this quote from Leslie Spear's ethnography on the Klamath, in which he stated that the Klamath do not make pictographs, by which he meant rock art in general. The few sites that exist in their country were said to have been made by Kamokamsh, the culture hero. See, Spear had assumed that the Klamath attributed the creation of rock art to Kamokamsh because they were just as unaware of its origin as anyone else. And this idea in turn led him and others to conclude that Klamath Basin rock art was unknowable, including the rock art of Petroglyph Point, simply because nobody appeared to know who actually made it. And as a result, most of the researchers who followed simply assumed that some mysterious Klamath Basin predecessor had made them prior to the arrival of the ancestral Klamath in Modoc, and that these predecessors had either gone extinct or had long since moved on. So subsequently, all of their research was focused on discovering the real makers of the rock art, while simultaneously dismissing information provided by our ancestors. And I think you can see here how those inquiries derailed the research because it led them off track. It led them to anybody but us. In actuality, what Spear failed to grasp is that those of our ancestors who were contributing their knowledge to his ethnography were speaking from a worldview that was peculiar to Westerners, a worldview that was deeply grounded in myth, or as we prefer, our sacred narratives. Native peoples, especially in the greater North American far west, generally believed that spirits dwell at certain places in the earth, and that when people would ritually tap into their power, well, they were understood to become those spirits. That is, that the spirits were thought to enter the bodies of the supplicants and then animate their actions. And so, for example, if they claimed that like a water spirit made a particular rock painting, we were talking about a person, probably a shaman, who had successfully acquired the supernatural powers of the water spirit and then made the painting as the water spirit. That is, that the water spirit was understood to be animating the actions of the artist. Well, in our myths, Kamokamsh or Kamush is every shaman's tutelary spirit. He's their primary spirit helper. Shamans cannot ritually act without the supernatural involvement of Kamokamsh. And in fact, by definition, that's the shaman's job, to channel spirits so that they could use their supernatural abilities. So when shamans created rock art, then our ancestors understood that it was Kamokamsh who was animating their actions. And so from the point of view of Spear's informants, our folks, Kamokamsh did in fact make the rock art, even though he may have seen the person of the shaman doing the actual painting. They understood that it was Kamokamsh who was animating their actions and simply tried to explain this to Spear from their own cultural perspective. But as I said, Spear, I hate to say it like this, missed this important connection between spirits, shamans, and rock art, and thus his understanding fell short. Like others, he failed to consider the sacred ideology that had inspired their answers. In actuality, rock art is an expression of the spiritual ideology contained in Klamath and Modoc myth, in the very same sense that a stained glass window from some Gothic cathedral is an expression of Christianity, but with one fundamental difference. See, whereas the Christian materials touch on your sense of aesthetics in order to reinforce the Christian doctrine, well, to inspire, the images that make up Klamath Basin rock art, in addition to doing all the above, also constitute the shaman's toolkit. And by this, I mean that these glyphs and paintings tended to serve very specific roles within the shamanic practice. And once again, these roles are described in great detail in the region's mythology. So for the past 22 years or so now, I've looked to these sacred narratives in order to inform my understanding of Klamath Basin rock art. And I started off doing this for two basic reasons. First off, I discovered that these sacred narratives actually identify powerful supernatural beings. How many have heard of Kamokamsh? How many have heard of Gagana, Skell, so on and so forth, Chashkai? Well, just a casual comparison with the ethnographic materials makes it very clear that these powerful beings of myth are also the spirit helpers that shamans use in their ritual practice. My claim today, is that these are the very spirit helpers we're seeing depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. That's what I'm attempting to demonstrate today. My second reason was that myth harbors the logic of the spirit world, how it operated. For example, everything in the spirit world was inverted or reversed from the natural physical world. Day here is night there. Mountains here are valleys there. What we would call bad behavior in the physical world is good behavior in the spirit world, and so on and so forth. Well, this law of inversion, sometimes called symbolic opposition, also shows up in much of the rock art. And that's why I chose the image here on the right. Now, I'm not completely sure what this figure is, although I do have some pretty strong ideas. But as you can see, it's actually a true reflection of itself. It's inverted, and it's divided by this here fissure in the rock face. So the concept of inversion is represented here. And let me quickly add that it's no accident that the artists organized these figures around this natural fissure. And the reason for this, and this is important, is that certain cracks and fissures among the rocks were believed to be portals or access points into the spirit world, which of course was located inside the earth. So by incorporating the fissure into this depiction, the artist effectively associated these figures with the supernatural world. And this, of course, means that these figures were inspired by an understanding of the spirit world and the laws that govern it. So in short, then, these stories constitute our ancestral worldview. And as such, there's no way we can understand the rock art or any of the rituals associated with the rock art without understanding these sacred narratives, because therein lies the ritual philosophy that inspired their creation. I have a well-regimented pattern here. So returning to my first point, I want to turn your attention now to some spirit beings that I've been able to identify in Klamath Basin rock art by consulting Klamath and Modoc mythology. And keep in mind that myth not only identifies these characters, but it also describes in great detail the nature of their supernatural powers, essentially why they appear in rock art in the first place. Now, as previously stated, the first and most widely known of these spirit beings is, of course, Kamoosh. And again, our Klamath ancestors, call him Kamokamsh. Now, as previously stated, Kamoosh is our creator spirit, but he's also considered to be the spirit of the sun. All throughout these tales, Kamoosh is intimately associated with the sun disk. The sun disk was his medicine or his spirit tool. Essentially, it was his mechanism for wielding certain kinds of supernatural power. Well, by virtue of the sun's regenerative properties, Kamokamsh's possession of the sun disk both made him immortal, and it also gave him the ability to cure or to rejuvenate the sick, and sometimes even bring people back to life, including himself. So this, in effect, makes the sun disk a curing tool. Well, once again, Kamoosh is the creator of shamanism, and thus he's every shaman's primary spirit helper. So by channeling the spirit Kamoosh, shamans were also able to access the sun disk's regenerative properties and likewise use them to cure the sick. And in fact, that's the shaman's primary role in the community, to cure by supernatural means. So what this means then is that Kamoosh's sun disk was available to shamans as a medicine tool, and that's why we see it depicted in the rock art. It was a shaman's tool or a mulwas, just as Spear's ethnography here had indicated. And attesting to this is the fact that the sun disk had its own spirit song, or what Gat Shed here called a Tamanawash song, which is Chinook and jargon for medicine, spirit power, that type of thing. Incantations or spirit songs were the primary means through which shamans invoked their spirit helpers. To invoke a spirit or a spirit's medicine tool like the sun disk, they needed the proper song given to them by that particular spirit during a power quest. And in fact, Gat Shed's observation here about shamans singing to painted rocks indicates that these paintings depicted their spirit helpers. And the reason I can make this claim is that because among the Klamath and Modoc, the concepts of singing and spirit being were one and the same thing. Our ancestors made no distinction between a spirit or its medicine song, its incantation song. In fact, as Spear points out right here, one word was used to describe both simultaneously. Suis, and please correct me at the end if I mispronounce that. So singing to painted rocks then was the same thing as singing to their spirit helpers. And this, once again, is why we see the sun disk, which had its own spirit song, depicted in the rock art. Now, my claim is that shamans were invoking its supernatural properties to cure sickness, because that's how Kamokams used the sun disk in myth. Now, another very powerful spirit described in these narratives is Skell, the mythological pine marten. Now, a pine marten is a tree-dwelling animal characterized by its elongated body and its triangular head. Oh, let me stop from my narrative here. I know that our word for pine marten is pap, but the name of the given name of the individual name of the mythological pine marten is Skell, sometimes called Skalamsh. And as you probably already know, anytime you add amsh to a name, it deifies it because it identifies it as something that existed in myth and has supernatural powers. Okay. Anyway, so like Kamoosh, Skell was one of the primary medicine spirits in myth. And accordingly, he also had a number of spirit songs, which shamans used to invoke him into their ritual service. Now, in some tales, his role was to provide supernatural curing through the use of his medicine stick, which he typically carried behind his ear like a pencil. In other tales, his role was to help shamans to diagnose the supernatural cause of a disease by scouting the landscape from the treetops, or sometimes right out there on the prairie, keeping a lookout for all these malicious disease-causing spirits that might be approaching the village from afar, or just as commonly, lurking in dark places within. Only shamans could discover these spirits through the use of spirit helpers like Skell. Now, like all the semi-naturalistic images that you're going to see today depicted in Klamath Basin rock art, Skell is typically depicted in stick-figured form. And this is because the artist didn't want to depict an actual physical pine marten. Otherwise, you just have a picture of a pine marten. Instead, they sought to symbolize the essence or the soul of a pine marten, something without flesh, so that the viewer would understand here that what was being conveyed was spiritual rather than natural, and thus they would know to keep away, since this kind of power or medicine was dangerous to non-shamans. And the way that Klamath Basin shamans routinely expressed this idea was by depicting only its most basic and recognizable characteristics. In this case, its elongated body and its triangular head. Now, this is an artistic convention known as synecdoche, where a part represents the whole. And I hope I just didn't destroy that word synecdoche, because it looks like synecdoche, but somebody else said synecdoche. So anyway, and we see this convention used all too frequently throughout Klamath Basin rock art. And this quote from Spear's ethnography at the bottom actually helps to explain why. It gives us a cultural reason why. Give you a second to read that. Now, with that being said, Skell is also sometimes depicted as a stylized human figure. Here, for example, we see his triangular head on top of a human-like body. This is another common convention in North American rock art, where spirits are presented in human-like form. Now, one explanation for this arrangement is that this figure is a self-portrait created by a shaman who has successfully acquired Skell as a medicine spirit during a shaman spirit quest. And they're seen here as one and the same being because the spirit is possessing and thus empowering its human host. So in other words, this is a picture of Skell being channeled by a shaman. So whoever this image depicts in, he or she is presented here as being fully potent to cure by supernatural means, which once again was the very essence of shamanism. Now note that Skell carries his medicine stick right up here where his ear would be, just like the tales described. Like Camush's sun disk, Skell's medicine stick had the power to regenerate life. Oh, you paid for that, so I thought I'd go ahead and throw it up there. Give you a second to read that. Now, there are still other times when all we see in the rock art is Skell's triangular head, all by itself. This is another example of synecdoche. On the upper left, for example, we see Skell's head possibly depicted alongside his medicine stick right here, although the lichens throw that into severe question. And here on the right, we see the head of Skell depicted here just below Camush's large sun disk above. And in this case, his medicine stick is missing. So once again, Skell was used for both diagnosing cases of sickness and disease and for ritual curing by means of his medicine stick. Now, the myths are just teeming with examples of his ritual exploits, and this is why we see Skell depicted in the rock art. Another spirit associated with the shaman's ritual curing practice is Old Man Mokas, the owl spirit. Now, the owl spirit actually turns up all over in Klamath Basin rock art, including the rock art of Petroglyph Point, which you can see over on the far right. Now, what makes the owl so vital to the shaman's ritual practice was, of course, its amazing vision, which enables it to hunt at nighttime. In other words, its vision enables it to see things hidden in dark places. And so, by way of metaphor, any shaman possessing this spirit's extraordinary vision was empowered to see things like hidden malicious spirits that might be causing sickness and disease. Or to put it another way, it enabled shamans to reach supernatural diagnoses. Now notice that the owl's eyes are the primary feature emphasized in the rock art. And in fact, if you notice, the shaman's incantation here makes a very specific reference to the owl's vision, which Albert Gatschet actually explains in a little further detail here below. There we go. And this quote below comes from one of several cliff notes in which Gatschet was trying to unpack the cultural meaning of each of the incantations that he included in his ethnographic sketch. And as you can see, his cliff note links the owl directly to the shaman's supernatural curing practice. Now, the horned owl seems to be a favorite in Klamath Basin rock art, as well as in our myths. But occasionally, we do see depictions of other owl species as well. This heart-shaped figure here from Petroglyph Point, for example, might at first strike the ordinary park visitor as a valentine of a sort. But in actuality, what we're seeing here is a representation of the barn owl. Note the outline of his face. See, in this figure, the artist simply chose to represent what he or she considered to be the most important or defining characteristic of the barn owl. And once again, this is an example of synecdoche. Now, like the horned owl, the barn owl specialized in hunting its prey at nighttime. And this in turn made it an ideal spirit helper. Using the barn owl as a medicine, shamans could seek out and eradicate dangerous hidden spirits that were thought to be causing harm or sickness within the village. And so this, in effect, makes the barn owl another medicine spirit. Finally, another very powerful spirit among the Klamath and Modoc is the Skokes, and I'm sure we've all heard of that one. Now, in the myths, Skokes are typically described as being half visible, with the visible portion looking much like a skeleton, or sometimes like an old woman bearing a bundle. But sometimes in the tales, Skokes takes on the appearance of a wood tick. Now, why a wood tick, you might ask? And I'm darn glad you did. Keeping in mind that all sicknesses were thought to have a supernatural origin, the most common diagnosis for an unexplained illness was the intrusive object disease, in which some malicious spirit was thought to have placed a malignant object into a person's body, leading to their sickness. Well, the cure for this was for the shaman to locate the object in the person's body, of course, with the use of supernatural vision, bite the patient in that area, and then literally remove the object by sucking it out of them. And the final step, of course, was to destroy the object in some way. Well, by way of analogy with this curing procedure, the wood tick made a very suitable medicine spirit to facilitate the shaman's ritual actions as he or she removed the intrusive object. And this, of course, is because ticks, well, what do wood ticks do? They bite their way into your body and suck your blood. Now note the Klamath incantation here recorded by Albert Gatz-Chet. Certain bugs had a spirit song, and thus a means by which shamans could call them into their ritual service and use them in precisely this way. And hence the words of this incantation. And this is why we see wood ticks and other bugs of this nature depicted at Klamath Basin rock art sites, including this stylized wood tick here from Petroglyph Point. Okay, so to briefly reiterate, myth identifies powerful supernatural beings. And once again, these are the same beings that shamans use as their spirit helpers and subsequently depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. That was my first point and essentially my primary claim. My second point, if you recall, is that myth harbors the logic of the spirit world. Now, this is extremely important because it's this logic that both structures and justifies ritual actions, including the creation and use of rock art. Now, for those of you who are familiar with these types of narratives, native myths, legends, folklore, as I'm sure all of us are, by the way, you probably noticed pretty early on that they don't follow the linear organization that's characteristic of Western literature, ever. The story's trajectory changes frequently, it changes without warning, and the characters seldom, if ever, act in a way that you and I might consider to be rational. Anything in these tales is possible. An ordinary bug can suddenly will itself to the size of a mammoth. It could talk, it could fly, and it could even change itself into another creature entirely, even becoming a human being. And similarly, the people in these tales could fly, they could live underwater, read minds, have conversations with animals, rocks, mountains, and understand them. Or they could instantly recover from death, dismemberment, and even complete incineration, and then go on with their day as if nothing unusual had just taken place. So the world of myth then was very bizarre, and it seemed to operate, well, much like our dreams. In fact, the more you read or the more you hear these tales being told, the more you come to realize that dreams are the organizing principle for these narratives. Now, this is important because what this means is that these narratives are grounded in our concept of the spirit world, which our ancestors believe they experienced from time to time during dreams. So critical were dreams for spiritual encounters that our ancestors repeatedly embarked on power quests throughout the whole course of their lives. Now, on these quests, initiates would venture alone into the wilderness where spirits live, and then spend the next several nights engaging in a lot of counterintuitive labor, whose only payoff was exhaustion and fatigue. And by counterintuitive labor, I'm not talking about worthless labor, but I am talking about the kind of labor that brought you no practical physical reward, like the acquisition of food or the shaping of a tool or the building of a lodge. And that's because the only goal for all of this ritualized labor was to induce a dream in which you were visited by spirits and received their song, their incantation song. Other folks would call this kind of dream a vision or a trance. So in this regard, counterintuitive labor was a pathway to the spirits. Counterintuitive labor was a pathway to the spirits because the resulting dreams placed you on the doorstep of the spirit world where visions and spirit visitations were possible. So how then did dreams give you supernatural power? If you've ever noticed, the landscape in your dreams is informed by your knowledge of the landscape in the natural physical world. Even if you don't recognize a specific location that you're dreaming about, you'll still see mountains, you'll still see trees, grass, sidewalks, and so on and so forth. So the landscape in your dreams then isn't all that different from the landscape in the natural physical world. It's in your physical limitations that we see the difference. See, in dreams, you can do almost anything. In dreams, you're capable of performing the very same feats as the supernatural beings of myth. You can fly, you can live underwater, you can read minds, see into the future, or you could instantly recover from death and dismemberment and then go on with your happy life as if nothing had just unusual had just taken place. It's also common to visit loved ones who have long since passed away, i.e., gone to the spirit world. And sometimes we can even visit with spirits like Kamoosh, like Skell, like Scopes. So it follows then that dreams are where you would go for spiritual counsel, or sometimes to acquire for yourself the supernatural abilities of spirits. Now, the ethnographer Albert Gatschet stated this idea very clearly in his quote here below. Dreams are to the savage man, as he put it, what the Bible is to us, the source of divine revelation, with the important difference that he can produce revelation through dreams at will. He was referring, of course, to the power quest. So for the Klamath and Modoc, then, dreams were the source of all things spiritual. And accordingly, myths were told as dreamtime narratives because that's what identifies them as being sacred. Or in other words, might be better to think of it like this. Myth is itself a sacred literary style. It essentially recreates the conditions in which the magic works. So these are stories of supernatural power grounded in our concept of the spirit world, and thus they constitute the worldview from which shamans drew their powers and their justifications to cure, to control the weather, to see into the future, all those things that shamans do. And just as important, myth also outlines the ritual procedures that shamans use to gain access to those powers. And these procedures, as it turns out, included the creation and use of rock art, as we shall see. So the previous two sections you just heard is what I like to call the gauntlet. Congratulations, you've now been through the gauntlet. So the 2 points I just detailed are critical for understanding the rock art of the Klamath Basin. So now at this juncture, I'm going to spend the remainder of our time zeroing in on the petroglyph point petroglyphs and start bringing this all together. Now, in preparation for this, there's just two very, very quick things we need to understand specifically about this monument. The first is that our ancestors believe that spirits live within this mountain. And in recognition of this, my claim is that the petroglyphs depict many of these spirits. The second is that our ancestors believe that shamans could access these spirits through trance and consult with them on matters related to their ritual practice, the most common of which was ritual curing. Now, this latter point about ritual curing is critical here because it brings us to one of the most important spirits in the shaman's curing enterprise, a spirit that was second only to Kamoosh himself. And this is the spirit I think we call Yayahiyahas. Yayahiyahas. Now, Yayahiyahas, according to the ethnographer Albert Gatschet, was the spirit of thunder. And as such, he wields thunder's terrible weapon, which of course was Lamesh, or lightning. So lightning then was the spirit tool of Yayahiyahas, in the same sense that Kamokamsh had the sun disk and Skell had his medicine stick. Now, according to the ethnographer Vern Ray, who did the work on the Modoc, lightning was among the first spirits that shamans called upon in any ritual curing ceremony. And this, of course, is because lightning enabled shamans to see what could not otherwise be seen. Lightning, after all, illuminates even the night sky. It brightens everything, and it spreads everywhere. So by way of metaphor, then, any shaman who possessed lightning as a medicine was empowered to see into the dark world of spirits, which of course was located inside the earth. Or in terms of ritual curing, it also enabled shamans to locate and identify the culprit spirits lurking nearby who had brought sickness and disease into the village. And so essentially, lightning enabled shamans to reach diagnoses. That is, to locate and identify the supernatural cause of a sickness. Now, if you take a close look at the zigzag in the slide here, you'll notice that there are a couple of circles appearing right in about the middle, right here. And of course, these circles were apparently meant to depict eyes. Well, when you think about it, this image provides us with a very striking metaphor for the spirit of lightning supernaturally enhanced, for the shaman's supernatural vision, supernaturally enhanced by the spirit lightning. My claim then is that this figure represents a shaman empowered to see into the spirit world, or at least to see spiritual things that ordinary folks could not see, such as the hidden cause of a person's sickness. So it's for this reason then that we see the lightning symbol associated with so many spirit figures depicted in Klamath Basin rock art. Essentially, lightning enabled shamans to see spirits, like Gamusha's sun disk here, a shaman's curing medicine, or like Skell, the mythical pine marten, another medicine spirit. Now note the triangular shape of his head and the presence of his medicine stick right up here. And here we have lightning symbols intermixed with a field of spirits, like these skeletal figures, which, if you recall, are another manifestation of the spirit Skokes. Another depiction of a barn owl, or at least the top of its head, right here, which we know now is another medicine spirit. And of course, we have this nucleated sunburst, once again depicting Kamusha's medicine tool, another curing symbol. So Yahyahyahas then, through his medicine tool lightning, is the spirit that enabled shamans to see either the culprit spirits causing sickness and disease, or their own spirit helpers living inside the earth, otherwise called their medicines, which were their remedies for bad spirits. So in short, lightning provided shamans with supernatural vision, and Yahyahyahas was the spirit that provided that power. Now, one other thing that the myths tell us about Yahyahyahas is that he has a very strong, if somewhat unbalanced, interest in fire drills and tobacco, especially tobacco. Whenever Yahyahyahas encountered anyone in these tales, the first thing that he always demanded was that they feed him tobacco smoke. And that's, of course, how you feed a spirit, smoke. Well, that part really isn't too much of a mystery, since we know that shamans routinely use tobacco in conjunction with calling their spirits. And in fact, that's the first step in any curing seance, as the ethnographers put it. But then what about his other requirement, that people carry around their fire drills? I mean, seriously, why would a spirit care whether or not you carried around your fire drill? Well, as it turns out, the story of the one-legged one, quoted up here in the slide, actually provides us with a very significant clue. See, in this tale, a group of hunters were camped on a mountaintop preparing for the coming hunt. Now, at one point during the preparations, actually very early in their preparations, the leader of the party suddenly took out his fire drill and started to spin it in the manner of starting a fire. Now, as he spun his fire drill, the rest of the company joined him as he suddenly started calling out to the mountains, seeking spirits to assist them in the coming hunt. Now, as they were all doing this, they had intended to exclude Yahyahyahas, which of course was a particularly powerful spirit that was dangerous, if not fatal, to those who were not initiated, non-shamans. And they just weren't prepared to see him at this point. Actually, I think the case was, if I recall, they had forgotten their tobacco or something. But before they could instruct their fire drill not to call him, I said before they could instruct their fire drill not to call him, Yahya appeared, demanding tobacco, as was his custom. Now, what's important to note here is that the story associated spinning the fire drill with calling out to the mountain in search of spirits, including the spirit Yahya, who, as you recall, brings lightning, also known as supernatural vision. Now, note in this story that spinning the fire drill not only produced a fire, it also produced a spirit. And that, of course, is what brings us back to Petroglyph Point. See, we know that the makers of the petroglyphs had either paddled their canoes out to the rock face to create their designs, or they walked over the ice if it was thick enough, probably both. Either way, I suggest that they would have had their fire drills with them, especially given its apparent supernatural properties. Because remember in the story, they not only use the fire drill to start a fire, they also use their fire drill to summon spirits. And that's exactly what I think is going on here at Petroglyph Point. My claim is that shamans ritually drilled these holes into the rock face as a means of calling their spirits, just as the myth described. Now, in most cases, you see drilled holes directly associated with particular spirit figures, like the image we see here. Because remember what I said about circles representing the sun disk of Kamoosh, triangles representing the head of the mythical pine marten, Skell. This part of Petroglyph Point is where some enterprising shaman sought out contact with these particular spirits by following the conventions prescribed by myth. Now, in this figure here, we can see where the shaman artist didn't simply drill holes as they called out to their spirits, but they simultaneously created patterns that sometimes took on the form of the spirits themselves, like the diamond chain you see on the upper left side of the crack. And you guys can ask me about that at the end if you want. And at other times, they work to frame their spirits, like the imagery you see to the right of the crack. Now, in this image, we can see holes drilled directly into this previously engraved triangular figure. Once again, the head of Skell, the mythical pine marten, a medicine spirit. Drilling holes into this figure was a direct appeal to the spirit Skell. So on Petroglyph Point, then, we see depictions of medicine spirits like Kamoosh and Skell, as well as evidence of shamans making supplications to these spirits, indicated by the presence of drilled holes. Drilling holes was a fundamental part of the supplication process, because drilling holes into a rock face, and thus not actually trying to start a fire, met the definition of counterintuitive labor, which, if you recall, was a pathway to the spirits. And thus you can equate this to a shaman's version of a power quest, whose ritual actions were inspired and informed by myth. Now, there's one last thing we need to talk about, promise, that involves Yahya, and that's the relationship between rattlesnakes and lightning. And I have to admit that I was unaware of this relationship for a very long time, more years than I care to imagine. But then about 7, 8 years ago, I came across a curious statement in Leslie Spears' ethnography on the Klamath, in which he commented that the rattlesnake's rattling was believed to bring thunder. And of course, I thought that that was a rather odd belief since it was so disprovable. I mean, all anyone would have to do when a rattlesnake rattled its tail was listen for the thunder. That's assuming, of course, you have the presence of mind to do it at that point. But when it didn't occur, as it very likely would not, well, then there goes your belief out the window. And so my thought was, why maintain such a shaky belief? But then at one point it dawned on me that this statement may have been a reference to the spirit of thunder, which, as you know, is Yahya, and that spirit just didn't realize this. So did rattlesnakes rattle bring Yahya, and can we see this in the rock art? Well, we know that you can see Yahya, at least implicated in the rock art by the presence of a spirit tool, which of course is lightning. So the test for me was, do we see lightning depicted in close association with anything in the rock art that might resemble a rattlesnake? Here we have a rattlesnake that appears to have been depicted in stick-figured form, using only straight or angled lines. And I know it's a little hard to make out. So you can see its tail here. Its elongated zigzag body here. And his diamond-shaped head with a protruding tongue here. Now, at first glance, we could easily assume that the artist simply chose to depict this rattlesnake in stick-figured form instead of using curved or wavy lines like we'd expect. But in actuality, what we have here is a rattlesnake that has been transformed into this zigzag figure by the presence of Yahas, so that we have a figure that simultaneously depicts rattlesnake and lightning. And this is how we know that Yahas is present here. Recall once again that spirits manifest themselves by possessing their hosts and thus transforming them. Just like we saw earlier with Skell depicted as a stylized human figure, essentially a human and Skell simultaneously. By depicting rattlesnake and lightning simultaneously, the artist indicated that Yahas, manifested as a spiritual lightning, was possessing the rattlesnake spirit and thus answering the rattlesnake summons. So Spirit's observation was apparently correct, even though he may not have fully appreciated its implications. Now here we see a similar depiction, but one that also takes the habits of an ordinary rattlesnake into account. Now at first you might think you're seeing two different figures. On the left, you see this large rattlesnake's rattle, possibly the act of rattling as suggested by the wavy lines that surround it. And on the right, we see another rattlesnake's body that has been transformed into the zigzag by the spirit lightning. Now, if you notice, both the rattle and the lightning body appear to be emerging from different parts of this large protrusion in the rock face. The rest of the rattlesnake is taken to be hidden underneath this protrusion, just like an ordinary rattlesnake would hide underneath a rock. So the suggestion is that the artist used the natural topography of the rock face to indicate that he or she had summoned rattlesnake and lightning, the rattlesnake and lightning spirits from the inside of this mountain, which, as you know, was believed to be inhabited by spirits. But as you can see, there's still more going on here. All the drilled holes you see below this composition indicates that some shaman was making supplications to these spirits using a fire drill. So figuratively then, in terms of ritual procedure defined by myth, we can see that a shaman had used two different methods to summon the spirit of thunder, a rattlesnake's rattle and a field of drilled holes, both of which were mythologically warranted. On Petroglyph Point, we encounter the very same elements. We see this rattlesnake figure with its head here turn sharply upward as it were crawling into the small crack in the rock face just above it. And in fact, the head is understood to have already disappeared inside of this small crack. We see hints of its rattle over here that appears to be emerging from this other spalled off section of the rock face. And the implication, of course, is that the rattlesnake is emerging from one part of the rock face and then crawling back into another. And so like you saw in the previous slide, the natural habits of an ordinary rattlesnake have been incorporated into this depiction, suggesting, of course, that it lived inside this mountain with the rest of the spirits. Over here, we have a series of nested zigzags juxtaposed with this large crack in the rock face on the left. My claim is that these nested zigzags symbolize lightning, and I'll explain why in just a moment. And then finally, we see shamans and medicine spirits manifested in the form of camouflage sun discs, right here. And if you look closely, we even see some repeated figures, like this other rattlesnake figure here. And we even see some scattered drilled holes, which I didn't bother to mark, too scattered. But in short, in terms of ritual procedure defined by myth, we see everything we expect to see. And let me quickly add that it's no accident that that these lightning motifs are juxtaposed with this large crack in the rock face on the left. Remember what I said earlier about cracks and fissures acting as portals or avenues into the spirit world. This arrangement here provides us with a very striking metaphor for the spirit of lightning illuminating the inside of this mountain where spirits were known to live. It's allowing a shaman to see directly into the spirit world, allowing them to search for their medicines. So here then, with the assistance of Yahahiyahas, some shaman made successful contact with the medicine spirit, Kamush, once again indicated by the presence of his sun discs below. Okay. Not to put too fine a point on it. Now remember this composition from the beginning. Oh man. When we take a look at one of the more complex sections of Petroglyph Point, we can actually understand what's going on here. The central figure, of course, is what? This long rattlesnake motif. And what is this long rattlesnake motif doing? It's cross-cutting this elongated zigzag to do here. Lightning, the symbol of Yahahiyahas. Now we know from our myths why this association is taking place, why these two figures are necessary for the rest of the composition. And if you look closely, we also find plenty of drilled holes, which we know now are synonymous with calling spirits. And I've identified just a few sample groupings here. There are of course others. And intermixed with this scene, we find plenty of spirit figures, most of which are in the form of Kamush's sun discs. So once again, we see everything we would expect to see if some shaman had visited the site, made appeals to Yahahiyahas with the rattlesnake motifs, and then, assisted by his medicine tool, lightning, made supplications to these spirits living inside the mountain by ritually drilling holes into the rock face, calling out for their spirit helpers. And finally, their efforts were rewarded by the manifestation of the shaman's medicine spirits, Kamush's sun discs. So here then is where a shaman, following a long and tedious ritualized process, made successful contact with our creator spirit, Kamush. So at the end of the day, Petroglyph Point is knowable. And it's knowable because we have a very strong informative literature preserved in the form of our myths, our long overlooked sacred narratives. Remember, this mountain is basically a lodge for spirits, and shamans came here for generations immemorial in search of their supernatural powers. Now, my claim is that the petroglyphs on this monument depict shamans' medicine spirits, as well as their ritualized efforts to contact those spirits with the assistance of rattlesnake, drilled holes, and Yahahiyahas, as prescribed by myth. What this means. What this means then is that these are not merely geometrical abstract markings, nor are they maps, nor are they star charts, nor are they doodling, and nor are they ancient Scandinavian fish tallies. These markings, in fact, are the prayers of our ancestors etched in stone, which makes sense because it was inside the stone where spirits live. So myth then provides us with an effective mechanism for understanding Klamath Basin rock art. But perhaps more importantly, perhaps most importantly, is that they provide us with a potential to understand the Petroglyph Point petroglyphs as our ancestors once did. As we move on to our questions and answers, I would ask you to just maybe take a glance at the acknowledgements. When I started studying Petroglyph Point, it was late in my research career up to this point. but it was built on all of the smaller sites. These individuals helped me to record for the last 22, 23 years now. They shared the same blood, sweat, and tears as I did. The organizational support provided lots of opportunities to go gambling. I mean, funding for the projects. My advisors were ecstatic that I was using native epistemologies to study rock art instead of archaeological methods. They were ecstatic that I wanted to abandon that and study it with our own literature. So please reserve a little appreciation in your hearts for them. And I'm going to go ahead and sit down while we open this up for questions because my knees are freaking killing me. Oh, I better take this, huh? Right. Oh, duck soup. Ready to go out and show my dad how to play basketball again. No, I'm warmed up now. Please feel free.
Nobody told me about this part of this job. Well, Dave, I want to thank you again. I understand, I see we've got some elders up there in the front of the room, so I'm a little hesitant to say more than I should here. But it strikes me, right, that what you're doing is beginning to give us back something that was systematically taken from us to the point of using laws to forbid this.
Totally.
And the effort that it's taken to untangle, right, what was taken from us and to pass it back to us is a real blessing. So I just want to say Mosef Ketcha for that.
Thank you, my friend. Thank
Much
you.
appreciated. It also strikes me, hearing this talk again, or parts of it again, about the importance of lightning and the use of fire, how much that parallels with what we are learning about the importance of lightning fires on our lands here in the proper management of a healthy ecosystem, and how the suppression of that has resulted in some of the mega fires, the disastrous fires that we're now seeing.
That's a good point.
And I have no doubt that our ancestors were very aware of the importance of fire and of lightning as the basis of that fire. So
I wouldn't doubt it.
yeah, I just want to say thank you again.
Thank you, Clay. I appreciate that.
Somebody else have a question or comment?
Yeah, I would just like to tell you that I really appreciate the presentation, and I find it very informative, and I hope that it arouses the curiosity of tribal members to visit the place.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm Georgine Wright Nelson, and I'm the new language department director. And
Oh, okay.
so I just want to say you're so right with stories being the guidance for our tribal families. We had a youth summit leadership conference start back in 2019, and Dr. Tom Ball came down, and he was a guest speaker.
Right on.
And he said that our stories are what tell our societies how to operate. And it gives us our values. It gives examples of what happens when you don't follow our values, and that we need to go back and we need to know these stories so we know how to raise our families and how to guide our societies. And so your work here exemplifies how important it was that our ancestors put it into a rock image so that we can, look at that. And everything you share reminds me so much of bits and pieces of what I've heard from other people when I was growing up. So thank you so much.
Thank
It's
you.
bringing me, it's really bringing me a good feeling to hear all this.
Thank you. And you're part of the language department, you say? Can you repeat that, what you do?
I'm the language department director.
Good, because you can maybe help me pronounce some of these names that I've been struggling
You're
with.
doing really excellent,
okay.
actually.
Thank you.
Dave, I have a question from one of our members online.
Sure thing.
Is there online access to some of the photographs that you've shared?
Oh, no, I don't usually put those online, but I'm certain, I'm happy to send them to tribal members. Well, I have
Great.
quite a ton of them,
Okay.
but the Petroglyph Point ones, well, you just go there, but I mean, I'm happy to do it. Clay and I, a couple of years ago, wherever he went. Oh, okay. Yeah, we went there and we went to Petroglyph Point for my book project. I'm doing a book and a documentary, many years from now. And we hundreds of photographs. So it'd be hard to know which ones to send, but I am happy to.
I'm sure. Good. So if you could share those with me, then I can share that with tribal members as well. Great. Okay. Okay, great. Thank you. Does anyone else have any other questions?
She gonna talk? Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, well, I'd just like to thank Pup David for coming down and and putting on this presentation, because I've known him since he was a baby, and I throughout the years I traveled with his dad, and we went everywhere playing ball, and everywhere you go, there's powwows and different tribes and people we talk with and we meet with, drink with, we drank a few with them too. But there's always the stories, we go there and we listen, and when I talk with Pup on the phone and stuff, we talk about his work and his books, and so finally I thought, well, dang it, he's never given a presentation down here. I want to hear it, and I want to bring him to the people, because I am proud of him for what he's done throughout the years. And, I'm getting older now, and old enough to be on the dang elders committee. I couldn't believe that, so, but, a lot of the older folks are gone now, people that I would listen to, and people that have mentored me, and and people say, well, go talk to the old people, go talk to. Well, a lot of the old people are gone now, and somebody said, well, we got to go talk to Heidi because she should know a lot. Well, Heidi's forgotten half the stuff she knew before, and so now I'm that way too, and so, but me, I think about all the old folks that I knew, and living out camp with grandma, and all the stories, and now the old folks are gone, so I go out and sit and look at the stars, and that's what takes me back, and but I miss the stories, and I was sitting in this elders meeting there, a couple of months ago, and we were talking about stories, and the history of the tribe and everything, and so it came up that we don't know a whole lot. We know some, but we don't know a whole lot, and that's what I said, well, there are tribal members that do know a lot, And I remember that you told me you had 8 books out, you know, and oh, public. Okay. Okay, well, okay, well, the deal is, you know, and I said, well, I know this young guy, you know, and, you know, he's educated and he can come help us, you know, and so, so even as an old fella now, you know, I'm ready to learn. I want to learn. So I want to thank you for coming down, and I want to thank George for helping this become a reality. All right, good to see you back.
Doctor, quick question and comment. If it's possible and you're okay with it, we would like to post this video on the member only site portal of the website. So if you're okay with that, we will make that happen for tribal members that are listening. It'll be in the member only page of the website. And I think your mic is off.
My kids knew how to turn this on. I don't. This one, look, oh, there we go. Right on. And yes, I still have a VCR that I can't program. Well, that's it then. Unless anybody has the uncontrollable urge to throw money at my feet, I guess we're done here. Oh, here we go. Here we go. Okay. Hello there. Oh, okay. Well, here, this one works.
Okay, all I wanted to do is I listened online because I was working in my office. My family taught a lot of what you taught, and I went to your presentation at the museum when you did that. And of course, I like this one better because it was targeted to us. And I'd like to see this taught to our youth when they go out, to be able to see before they go out what they mean. So they're not out there asking us questions on what these mean. And then I wanted to tell you, being around some of the the Alturas tribes, they used to scare their children by saying Yaya was going to get them if they went outside at night.
Well, yeah, actually, Albert Gatschet identifies Yaya Hiyahas as the frightener. And Yaya was the first 2 words in his invocation song. So there might be something to that. All right, folks, well, leave your quarter by the table and thanks, thanks for showing up. You guys take care. Thank you so much. Duck soup. Just like I was 20 again. There we go.
So then we
Oh,
just
thank you. There we go. Oh, yeah, thank you.